Today's scripture reading is from Deuteronomy 30, verses 15 through 20. Look, today I've set before you life and what's good versus death and what's wrong. If you obey the Lord your God's commandments that I am commanding you right now by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways and by keeping his commandments, his regulations, and his case laws, then you will live and thrive. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you refuse to listen and are misled, worshiping other gods and serving them, I'm telling you right now that you will definitely die. You will not prolong your life on the fertile lands that you are crossing the Jordan River to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth as my witnesses against you right now. I have set life and death, blessing and curse before you. Now choose life so that you and your descendants will live. By loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice and clinging to him, that's how you will survive and live long on the fertile land the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
So I continued the story that I started with the kids. I, like most folks, reflect on my life and specifically my years growing up. So making this basketball, this earth basketball, occurred when I was a chaplain during my last year of seminary. It was one of the most impactful exercises we did was to look at our life cycle, the good, the bad, the in-betweens, and after that exercise we went right into family systems theory, getting deep, really uncomfortably deep, into how we as individuals handled various parts of our life, how our families of origin handled cycles of life, and how we might learn and grow from that reflection. Now, having been someone who believes in therapy and having had my share over the years, I thought that these would be easy exercises when they laid them out before us. But wow, was I surprised. They were not easy. It's not always easy to reflect on our lives objectively, is it? And yet it remains and is one of the most important things I can do, is to reflect on my life, to look at those times, to try to make some sense and to ask for God's direction. When reflecting on my upbringing, my parents always put on a united front. Now, they may have argued behind closed doors, but to us there was no splitting hairs with my parents. My dad pretty much stayed out of the day-to-day decision-making for us kids. Mom was the go-to person for permission to pretty much anything. Disney dad was the fun. As I look back, it really wasn't very fair to my mom. But in time, I came to appreciate her discipline and her values as much or more than I appreciated the fun time of dune buggies and motorcycles with my dad. My mom loves us, always has. And yet she was the kind of mom, she is the kind of mom that will offer advice with the best intentions. And yet, should we choose not to follow that advice, she'll sit back and watch us reap the consequences. And I've done my share of reaping, whether it be with career decisions or family decisions, financial decisions, relationship decisions. As a kid, I was really involved in athletics, but my mom refused to become the coach's friend in order for my brother Doug and I to get playing time. We had to do that on our own. I grew up in a neighborhood of kids, the old days of playing outside until dark, of shoving dinner down quickly because you couldn't leave the table until your plates were empty. After all, being wasteful wasn't an option because kids in a third world country were starving. And poor me, I never quite figured out until some years later that whether or not I cleaned my plate, that issue would not be solved, and still isn't. I played sports a lot, had girlfriends, not that kind. I had girls as friends, and And we were close, but they didn't play sports. So as the only girl in our neighborhood that did, I took my fair share of shots. Now, I wasn't the last one chosen on teams, and whether we were playing baseball or basketball or football, I could hold my own with the boys. But even at that age, they worked pretty hard to not be shown up by a girl. I remember vividly one day playing tackle football. Yeah, you heard that right. Tackle football. No helmet, no pads. Tackle football. I was the only girl. And there was a wide age range, and I was about 9, probably 4 feet tall, about 90 pounds. And one of the older guys, his name's Jimmy Rogers. He was running for a touchdown, and I decided I'd try to tackle him. Well, Jimmy stiff-armed me, and I literally wrapped around a tree. And I staggered home holding my stomach and trying to catch my breath. And I remember walking into the mobile home we were living in and Mom saying, "Well, I told you what happened. You kept playing tackle football with those boys." Well, thanks for the compassion, Mama. It's all to say that my mom was and is a wonderful, loving, attentive, and nurturing parent, but Mom would allow us to skin our knees, either literally or figuratively, so that we could learn valuable lessons. In other words, Mom thought that allowing us to fall would teach us how to get up. And she never allowed us to stay down. And her mantra was and still is, you may find yourself on the mat, but it is your choice whether or not to stay there. This morning in our scripture, we find people on the mat in a big way. It wasn't the first time God's people would find themselves downtrodden, and it wouldn't be the last. Those that preach a gospel of prosperity are, I think, very dangerous. And there's a slew of them preaching. If you don't believe me, turn on the television or visit a few places on maybe Sunday night. They say, if you do everything you're supposed to do, you won't get sick of body and mind and spirit. If you give to the church the way you ought to give, your finances are going to be fine. You're going to be secure. And many of those sermons are based on this scripture today. And in fairness, it seems that God is saying, I've given you the choice between life and prosperity or death and adversity. Listen again. I've set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I'm commanding you today by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you're entering to possess. But if your heart turns away, and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare you today that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that you're crossing the Jordan to enter. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I've set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live. Reading this scripture on the surface. Let me say that again. Reading this scripture on the surface would give credibility to prosperity gospel preaching and make God out to be as hardcore as my mom. For every action, there's a reaction. For every decision, there's a consequence. And this holds true in many cases. All of us have been at intersections in our life, times when we had to make critical decisions about relationships or career or health. And our decisions had a direct impact on our consequences. You know, I've been in a family business now for over 20 years. It's had more ups than downs. It's been more financially secure than ministry. But I got to tell you, there's a huge part of me that wishes I had gone against the grain and become a minister at an earlier age than 48. For ministry is my passion. It's my call. And I heard that call as a teenager who knew I was gay, hearing God's call in an Appalachian Southern Baptist church, impossible for me to ever be a minister. Well, it was impossible until I took steps to take a chance and find a church who would embrace me fully. It was impossible until I found a seminary who would accept me as I am. It was impossible till I found a denomination that would ordain me. It was impossible until I traveled across the country to San Jose, California, to have my theology and ministry shaped in transformative ways. Impossible for me to ever be a minister? Living on the edge of possibilities. Well, that leads us back to our scripture. For beyond the surface, we know that the writer of Deuteronomy, we don't know who it is, but the writer was appealing to the people of Israel, the only ones in the ancient community who put God with a capital G above other deities that were worshipped. Now, make no mistake, and some preachers gloss over this, but even the earliest believers in God worshipped other gods. Sun gods, crop gods, rain gods. It was very common in the ancient community. But the Israelites worshiped God with a capital G, Creator God, and this made them stand out. It made them seem odd. It made them seem uneducated and ill-informed because over and over again, the tribe suffered plagues and illnesses. They were torn apart by war after war, and yet something kept them drawn in. And so the leaders came up with some covenants, including the 10 Commandments, but not limited to those. The intent was to create laws and rules that would separate them from the rest of society and give them reasons to get off the mat. Indeed, to give them reasons to remain faithful to God. So the entire book of Deuteronomy is based on giving out laws and then encouraging folks to follow them. For like us, they were tempted to throw religion out the door because it didn't seem to be working out quite so well for them. Our scripture is not designed here to say, if you do this right, then life will be good. If you do not, then life will be bad. Rather, it was written to remind the ancient community that no matter what they faced in life, they should hold tightly to God's presence and God's promise. Listen, God knew, as did the writer of Deuteronomy, whoever he was, he knew that godly living would not spare folks from evil, disease, war, difficult days of living. Look around. Don't we know that's not true? Some of the godliest people I've ever known have faced the most difficult challenges. And yet the message is that at these intersections of choosing God's will versus choosing our own, following God's call is always the better way. Many of those in the ancient community were hearing these words, including Moses, the one who brought the 10 Commandments down from the mountain. Many of them didn't see the promised land, and yet their call was to remain true to godly living. And the key verse is at the end of verse 19. God says, choose life so that your descendants may live. In other words, my brothers and sisters, we got to do our share in full partnership with God. We may think that it's not possible to fill in the blank for yourself. Many of us thought it would never be possible to be married, but we are. Many of us thought it would never be possible to be free, but we are. Many of us women thought we would never be allowed to vote, but we can. And some of us thought we would never be a minister. We're reminded that with God all things are possible. Maybe not in the way we imagine, maybe not in the timing we wish it to be. And in truth, we may never know or see the difference we make or the end in sight. But God's got a purpose for us. I promise you that. And we can't give up or give in. For friends, we're here today, and what we have in common is every single one of us is breathing life. Given the precious gift of life, and God is calling our attention to it and saying, choose life. In the lifetime of me and my grandparents, the impossible has occurred. An evil Hitler was defeated and Jews finally spared. And I can promise you, in the height of that, many thought it would be impossible to ever stop the horrendous murders of innocent people. Women were given the right to vote. Desegregation became the law of the land, as has more recently marriage equality. Impossible? What seems impossible in your life? What choices have you made that have brought you to the edge? And if you find yourself on the edge, might you accept that you're on the edge of possibility? What decisions might you make that'll change the direction of your life? That'll make your life deeper, more meaningful. So many times we live on the edge of impossibility. And God is calling us to live on the edge of possibility. Listen, we're going to skin our knees. And we're going to get stiff-armed and wrapped around trees. We're going to lose our breath. And sometimes it's because we haven't listened. Sometimes it's just because life happens. It happens to all of us. And we're tempted to throw in the towel, to give up, to blame others. We're tempted to distance ourselves from God or others. We don't know how our life story is going to end, do we? We have our hopes, we have our dreams, and sometimes circumstances have a way of disturbing those. And yet we're reminded that when we can, at our intersections, choose life. Make life count. Choose people to be surrounded with that are life-giving, not life-taking. Choose jobs and careers that bring you joy and make some kind of difference. Choose hobbies that tap into your unique gifts. Choose issues of social justice that you are passionate about. Choose life. I remember another thing about my childhood. I was in first grade. And in our family, we watched the nightly news. Much to Brenda's chagrin, I still watch it for about 2 hours a night. Now, I don't remember this particular segment, but I've been reminded of it often.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over that. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Wow. A simple man facing insurmountable and impossible odds. He was in a minority, had little money because he was just a minister. His burden was heavy as just a simple man trying to change the world. And indeed he did. But he never got to see it. It may seem odd to you and I because we think we know how his story ended. Tragically, at the hands of a cowardly murderer. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated the day after he gave this speech, "I've been to the mountaintop." But you see, he knew how the real story would end. And thus his decision from his own words, "I've seen the other side. And I know we're going to get there." See, he knew that he had to choose life. He chose to live into his calling, to be obedient to God and remain faithful even in times of fear and doubt. His decisions resulted in life eternal for him. He was sure of that. Oh, to have that faith. Oh, to have the guts to choose life when it seems like in doing so you may lose your own. What a way to navigate life's intersections. I've read where it says, choose life.